We're getting pretty close to 10 o'clock now. So let's get started. I gave this talk to this group um, uh, about 5 years ago. And since then, I had it just sitting around on my computer, and I was invited by the Thorium Energy Alliance to attend a meeting in Oak Ridge, of all places, and present a summary of this book. And so, but John, the coach, the organizer said, Richard, you can't make it a 1 hour talk. We don't have time for that. Cut it way back. So I cut the number of slides in half and rushed through them. And that's all I had on my computer for a while until I stumbled over some of the old deleted slides and put most of them back in. So this has been a rebuilt collection of slides. I'll make it clear when I stick some extra ones in, and I think it'll last about an hour or so. And for those of you who've seen it before, I think after 5 years, it's complicated enough that you won't mind seeing some of the slides again. I hope not. So we'll move on to the next slide. It's a sensitive book, beautifully written, and I think Alvin is the appropriate historian to have written this, and I think it's very fairly and honestly written. He first of all goes into his life. He was born in 1915, died in 2005, so that would be the age of 90. These people lived to a ripe old age, even though they were associated with radiation, and who knows, it might have been a little bit of radiation hormesis going on. But this talk is the really crucial days were the first 4 years or so of World War II. But he was director of the laboratory, Oak Ridge National Lab, for about 30 years after the war was over. His PhD at the University of Chicago used diffusion theory to understand neurophysiology. And please pardon me for reading some of this, but at my age, I can't remember it as well as the writing is, so I'm just going to read it with you. But with World War II starting, he was asked to apply his diffusion skills to see if beryllium would be a good moderator for a nuclear reactor. It turns out beryllium was not, but a very good moderator. His boss, Carl Eckert, suddenly took off for California. So I traced him down, and he took over oceanography and worked for the Navy for a while, and then as a marine ecologist, and was quite had an important role in that position. And perhaps he found that a relief from the job that he had been really given. Eugene Wigner came in right as Carl was leaving, and he informed Alvin that the real purpose of the project, not to fool around that much with beryllium, was to create plutonium. Plutonium is I think they don't put PL because that's platinum, so they put in a U. And so we think of plutonium as something we don't want to have in our pockets for very long. So I always think of the smell that you get from something smelly. And that's how I remember that a U comes after the P and not an L. It's an isotope 239, which is quite powerful and can be used in making atomic bombs and was used for the second bomb in Nagasaki. They used this work to study the nature of the chain reaction. I'll go into that in a little bit of detail. Both men worked out a theory of how the chain reaction can be achieved and the best ways to study and analyze it. So here is a picture of Eugene Wigner, Alvin's boss. They got along very well, fortunately. Eugene was a Nobel laureate in 1963 for atomic number theory, and he also lived to a ripe age of 93 or so. There were many other people mentioned briefly in this book, but not very much. Arthur Compton was sort of the head honcho who looked after and was responsible for a number of these labs. He was a Nobel laureate going way back to 1927. Leo Szilard, a brilliant man, conceived the whole idea of a nuclear chain reaction. Walter Zinn came from Canada. He calculated pile size for reactors and worked quite extensively out at other laboratories, particularly out west. Bob Christie helped Weinberg with lattice design. That is, you have to have a lattice upon which to put these little blobs of uranium, and you have to space them out so they don't get all bunched together. And so that is done. I'm not going to go into the details of uranium placement in reactors in this talk, but just to know that Bob Christie helped out. Gail Young was a close collaborator with Wigner, and we all know a lot about Robert Oppenheimer now. He and Ed Teller visited occasionally, but not for very long.
Richard, what is pile size? What does that mean?
That's a good question. I'm going to define that momentarily, so you're right with me. Thank you.
Okay,
Lee.
thank you.
Yeah. Immediately after the first fission in a block of solid uranium, neutrons are slowed by collisions with 238 because the vast majority of it, over 99% of it, is the more stable isotope 238. And as soon as those are hit by neutrons, they're converted to plutonium. And that sort of finishes the chain reaction because the plutonium then can fission, but it's a different, it's from a different nuclide. So what you have to do to maintain a chain reaction is to slow the neutrons from fission, which are very powerful, down to what are called thermal energy levels, about 1,000-fold or more with a moderator. Now the moderator can be any one of a number of things that can interact with neutrons and with a high probability. And they find that if they use some 235, which is normally present less than 1% of the time, if they increase that amount of then it will fission with a high probability. And you can do that with a number of things, including water. And that's ultimately what they use. To deal with Lee's question, they had to disperse the uranium atoms within the moderator such that the neutrons are slowed immediately. And so you imagine that the uranium nuclei is raisins in a big cake of graphite. Now we come to this word pile. It seems funny, but it was, they piled up all this graphite in the in a sports court in Chicago. And they've always called it a pile because they just piled up all this graphite in it. So it became a common use term for setting up a reactor because you needed to have a certain amount of graphite to moderate it and protect yourself from the neutrons. So you have to have a pile that's large enough so that the neutrons escaping from the surface of the pile are just balanced by the neutrons that are being produced by fissioning the 235 inside the pile. And when the two are in balance, then the pile is said to be critical. Now, critical does not mean it's ready to blow up, as most people might think. It just means that everything is in balance. And of course, there's a number we'll come to in a moment called the multiplication factor, K. And when it's in balance, it's still, if anything momentarily dropped it below critical, the whole thing would stop. And so you need to have it slightly above by 2 or 3%, the neutrons coming out of the pile as opposed to those being generated inside the pile as opposed to that are leaving outside. So this is perhaps going to explain it a little bit better. If we make the pile larger than ideal for criticality, then the reactor is said to be supercritical. Again, does not mean it's going to blow up. It just means it's going to continue and run away should not be thought of as blowing up either. It means it'll continue to build up to a stable heating temperature. If the pile is smaller, it'll be subcritical and the chain reaction will dwindle and die. And after World War II, when people went in to see how far Germany had come along in building a reactor, they found that they had some good ideas, but they did not have a pile large enough to make it work. And so it would have taken them probably another year or two, but we were worried that they would beat us to the draw. I had no idea in reading about this as a kid and a teenager that they were so worried about the Nazis in Germany, and they're competing with us. And that's what drove these people at Oak Ridge to work so diligently. So that's the multiplication constant, K, and it's 1 for a perfect chain reaction. But to have it working practically, it should be a little larger than 1 by 3 or 4%. And this is the image of an incoming neutron and hitting a nuclear fuel nucleus. In this case, most of the time, uranium-235, and that's splitting up into some fission fractions. They're never exactly the same. They're often, practically always, slightly different in size, and 2 or 3 fission products. On the average, it's 2.5. So they have 3 shown there. There's a bit of going from the theory back to the history. I didn't realize this either, that Fermi was only able to obtain a K value of 0.87 back in October. He'd been working on it for a while, and he realized that he had to get it above that, and he was working in this squash court that you can see over on the right. He improved his pile by making 31 experiments over a 1.5 year so time. After much refinement of the lattice in the pile, that is, setting the raisins at the right distance in the cake of graphite, and he also had to remove traces of boron that were in the graphite that inhibited a lot the reaction. You can see at the very bottom there a guy standing in a lab coat pulling a rod out, and that's a rod of boron, and that inhibits the reaction. And by pulling that out, he can pull out some of the absorbed neutron inhibitors, allowing things to move ahead a little bit. And that was done on December the 2nd, 1942. So it was just, this book was written in 1992, and the 50th anniversary of that discovery. Weinberg, unfortunately, was not present. He was rather regretted that. He was just a graduate student, so he ranked 54th, and they only had room for the top 50. And so he was regretfully not there to witness that.
Can
Anyway,
I make a comment?
Sure,
Uh,
Stephen.
the whole basis here, and my comment goes back to your note about the German findings. We're talking here about a moderator, which is the surrounding substances around the fissile material. And carbon is easy to handle because you don't need a container. But the Germans were targeting a physical containment that would hold heavy water, which is a smaller, better moderator, and that was held up by the Norwegian events. So
Yes, thank you. That's a good point. I didn't bring that in, but that does bring in a lot of history of heavy water from Norway being slowing them down. Thank you for that.
and Canada is still pursuing that very successfully.
Yes, and so is Copenhagen Atomics. So although they're still in the early stages, but yeah, Canada has used heavy water for years, and they do talk about it a little bit more coming up here. Notice that these designs were begun in April 1942, 8 months before Fermi got K up to 1. But the designs were begun already for making plutonium-generating reactors, and the cooling material was discussed at length, and Wigner, Weinberg's boss, finally chose natural water, and the natural, of course, means not heavy water, but just the water that comes out of our taps. That is, just has a proton in the nucleus and an electron spinning, whereas heavy water has a neutron along with a proton in the nucleus, and that's called deuterium. So plans were submitted in January 1943, and a 500 megawatt reactor was built in Hanford, Washington by DuPont to produce 500 grams per day. So that was the history over that period of time when they were starting to make plutonium bombs. Weinberg really is impressed by his boss, Wigner, and he likened his creation of this complex reactor because there are about 1,000 different permutations and combinations that one could choose. And Wigner had to think of them all with a lot of intelligence of a brilliant physicist and come up with one that was practical, wouldn't get people into problems, and could be used industrially for making more and more of these bombs. But he compared it to Mozart composing a piano concerto. Wigner, he said, may have taken 4 months to Mozart's few days, but the complexity was enormous. And he viewed every day's delay for making the bomb as a gift to the Nazis. So this puts attention into it that I wasn't aware of until reading more into this story. Here's a picture of Enrico Fermi off to the right. So in April of 1944, he and Leo Szilard outlined ideas for fast reactors. And the next day, Szilard came up with the name breeders. And this was something that produced more plutonium than they consumed. We'll get back to this in a little while. I think the whole idea here is fascinating. Back then, they believed that breeders were essential for future energy because at that point, we were getting our uranium from the Belgian Congo. We didn't realize that it was not that hard to find in Canada or in parts of the United States or elsewhere. And we thought we had to get it only from there. And so we felt we'd need to breed more and more of the uranium. I'm going to give you a little shortcut. This is not in the book, but it helps I understand the word breeding. I found it was a difficult concept to appreciate unless one, first of all, thought of the conversion ratio. The conversion ratio is the ratio of new fissile atoms produced to the fissile atoms consumed. So something that is fissile then is something that spontaneously fissions, whereas below it, you see here the word fertile. Those are other transuranics like uranium 238 that can be made fissile by having it being hit by a neutron. But in the case of 238, it just becomes plutonium, and so you lose it from the typical uranium chain reaction that you've thought of in your calculations. But the point is that fissile transuranics have atomic weights that are odd numbers. We often think of uranium-235 as the prime one, but thorium converts into uranium-233, which also fissions. So you have the thorium precursor for that one, and the uranium-230, which is 232, and uranium-238, the precursor for 235 that will fission. So breeding occurs then when a reactor generates more fissile material than it consumes, and the conversion ratio exceeds 1. And so the example I just mentioned, 238 and a neutron going to plutonium, and 232 plus a neutron going to uranium-233. I think it's important to appreciate that breeding is very important because we have this thing called waste that we don't like to talk about or think about because it's so abused and misunderstood, but you can diminish tremendously the amount of waste that you have if you breed new material. Then you basically have what they call in Copenhagen atomics, you have a waste burner. Not everybody likes that word, but it's a word that Thomas Jem likes to use in at Copenhagen Atomics, and it it has a benefit in explaining to the public. The public might not understand breeding very well, but if you say it's a waste burner, at least, and it does that, if you have a breeder, then you can achieve that problem, because one of the biggest problems aside from cost is the public perception of waste, even though the amount of waste is so small compared to coal and even burning wood chips, which is considered a positive renewable energy by many people, much less waste from the fission of an atomic nucleus. So it's a problem of perception. So this, excuse me, pressurized light water reactors, it really began in earnest in 1944. And this is a photo again of Wigner. You can see he's a baldish fellow, and Weinberg here was a little more hair. And they met years later, and Weinberg felt that he had aged so much because his hair had turned white, and Weinberg's baldness was stable. So he said that he had aged much more than Wigner. Anyway, they did their experiments with non-enriched uranium initially. It was light water. And they found that they couldn't get K to quite get up to 1, even with the best lattice configuration they could come up with. So Weinberg reasoned that they could make more plutonium for bombs by using low enriched uranium, or LEU, moderated and cooled with pressurized light water. So they avoided the cost and expense of heavy water, but they did have to do some enrichment from the regular uranium that's mined. These two improvements became the standard for building future light water reactors, and that's important to recognize that this became the standard, which was not only used for making plutonium and for bombs, but later used for making heat and especially electricity. Need to just review a couple of facts about uranium as a fuel, just to review what I just said. The natural uranium then is 0.7, that's 0.7%, 235. All the rest of it that you mine out of the ground is 99%, 238. So it's a huge, huge benefit. And that's because over the years, this has been decaying and fissioning spontaneously in a few places in Africa where the temperature was just right back in geologic times. And so there was actually some natural fission going on, and so that's why we have less of this than we had millions of years ago now, and we have a lot less now, and eventually it's all going to be gone. So we enrich it, and typically we take it up to 5%, some places 3.5%, but that's what we call with low enriched uranium. Lately, we've been using a term HALEU, HALEU, and that's raising it up to maximum of 20%. That is felt to be useful for some of the more advanced reactors, but still a long way from weapons grade uranium, where it is enriched up to 90%. So that's for weapons grade. So this is important to recognize that there are a number of different ways to enrich the amount of uranium 235. You can use a centrifuge. There are other methods as well that were developed during and immediately after the war that are used, but they're more complicated. Just thought I would.
One point.
Yeah.
The higher enrichment allows you to make the mass of uranium more compact and still go critical. So
yeah,
that gives us the modular reactor capability.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you. I thought that most of us don't know about Farrington Daniels. He was a professor of chemistry right here at the University of Wisconsin. He was an imaginative guy. He developed a way to fix nitrogen as a first step in making explosives. His device consisted of a heap of hot pebbles of magnesium oxide. It was contained in a large pressure shell. Nitrogen in the air that flowed through the pile became fixed to the pebbles as magnesium nitride. He joined the Chicago group to see if he could, instead of using pebbles of magnesium oxide, if he used hot uranium. And he would cool that with helium gas percolating up through them, and that would make a simple, safe device. He met many skeptics at Chicago, partly because he needed to have the uranium highly enriched in the first place. But his pebble bed idea is still being developed today and used in some countries. It's an interesting little sidelight. They also had a code name for a pile that was moderated by heavy water. And they call that the P9 episode because of the code name for that particular pile. 1942, Wigner and Weinberg realized that K, obtained with heavy water as a moderator, really improved the value of K, the multiplication factor, by around 10%, which is pretty considerable. And so they started using that in various places, particularly out in Hanford. And the people in Hanford called after a little while. They encountered an unexpected glitch in that xenon 135 was a gas, of course, an inert gas, but it was highly absorbing of neutrons and was considered a poison, is a term they used for the chain reaction. And it took a little while. I summarized pages and pages of the book by saying "and adapted" because it's quite involved and we don't need to go into it all here. He of course wrote it up because he was very involved at the time. But it does add a complication to the light water reactors that we have today because these reactors are dealing with a metal encased in alloy tubing and with a water moderator. And so you do have some of this xenon poisoning going on, and you have to find ways of dealing with it or it will stop the reaction. Also in Canada, they had these piles at Chalk River, and Alvin was sent there and turned out he ran into some Soviet agents there. There were other Soviet agents that infiltrated the people even at Oak Ridge that were not talked about very much in this book, but that was an interesting sidelight. This is just sort of an interesting photograph of the Clinton labs. It's part of Compton's metallurgical lab. It's a sibling of his other branch at Argonne lab, run by DuPont and the Corps of Engineers. So the atmosphere here is very different from that of a university like the University of Chicago, very militaristic. This building that you see here was called the X-10 Research Reactor, in-house in the Clinton labs. It was built in 9 months. So they were clearly driven by their fear of the Nazis. It went critical on November the 4th, 1943, and later developed 1 megawatt. 6 other very different research reactors were built there over the next few decades. So things were really hopping there. And when you consider that people went off to work there with or without their families, and that was just an isolated part of the hills of Tennessee for years, and nobody knew where they were or what they were doing. It was a very secretive operation. Along the way comes Leo Szilard. He's a brilliant theorist, and he proposed 2 things. First, he said that all papers on fission should be withheld from publication. Well, that immediately told the world, especially Russia, that as well as Germany, that we must be up to something. And so that, in a way, was natural for him to want to do that, but it gave a signal around the world right away. By early 1945, we heard of great progress in Los Alamos on the bomb design, and Leo was convinced that bombing civilians would place a moral onus on us, not unlike that borne by the Germans, who had used the poison gas in World War I. So he therefore led attempts by scientists to mobilize against its use, and there was a book written in the footnote at the bottom. I've not read the book. I'm tempted to, but haven't found the time yet. A Peril and a Hope, the scientific movement in America of 1945 to 7, of the people who were opposed to using the atomic bomb. Arthur Compton was a very powerful fellow, and he countered with specific choices and advice about reducing mortality and morbidity in the general population, and how to try and do that. Anyway, Alvin was invited to take over Oak Ridge after the war was over, and he ran it for close to 30 years. He accepted the position after many others had walked away. For many reasons, he liked the region, but he was able to appreciate the unique scientific contributions of this lab. And in the early days, they explored all sorts of power reactors, compared the advantages and disadvantages of each type. And that's significant because we're going to come to some of the 1,000 possible ways of combining various fuels for us to know about. But once pressurized water gained a foothold, other possibilities, unfortunately, were preempted as being too expensive. That was the key word, too expensive. France, meanwhile, and other countries, Japan, Russia, China, did not take that concern, and they recycled their uranium, so they didn't have so much of a so-called spent fuel or waste problem. These are extra slides that I found that I just sort of stuck in here. It's a nice shot of Alvin at his desk. He went to Argonne to strike a gentleman's agreement with the director there, Walter Zinn. He said that Oak Ridge would focus on developing research reactors and breeder reactors based on liquid fuels, which didn't seem to interest anybody else very much. He promised that Oak Ridge would not compete with Argonne in developing power reactors using solid fuels. So that was good for Zinn and was good for Oak Ridge, and they built 13 research reactors. He also started a school of reactor technology, and this is a classic picture at the head of his class in 1946. It was the first nuclear engineering school in this country and a model for university courses. I like the name, Doctors of Pile Engineering, DOPE, awarded to industry and Navy personnel. Rickover, of course, was one of his students. He came to Oak Ridge after World War II to attend his course on reactor theory. Years later, when they called him Rick, and his naval team returned to the lab to decide on a coolant for the first nuclear submarine reactor, they had to be persuaded to accept the ideas of compactness and simplicity, that is boiling water, over the high efficiency of hot sodium. Hot sodium is not going to go over too well with any seawater that gets into the sub. So, but Rickover was so impressed with the efficiency of sodium that they had to talk him back, and Rickover, in classic fashion, would say, well, progress in this field is 99% engineering and 1% physics. He didn't have very much respect for the physicists. And this is Weinberg's comments about Rickover. He said he disliked sharing credit with others. He had many qualities that made up for his unsophisticated command of the details of nuclear engineering. I like that word, unsophisticated. He was totally dedicated and showed complete self-confidence. He used rudeness as a method, making him as nervy as anyone I have ever met. So that's pretty strong words those are for Alvin. And so he didn't get along, and Rickover later influenced others who managed to get him, Alvin Weinberg, fired. So it's too bad that they didn't get along, but I can imagine only people who would be subservient to Rickover might get along with him. Certainly Jimmy Carter, I think, was one of them. And he liked Rickover, thought he was one of the smartest men he ever met. Then we come to this other term called NEPA. It stands for Nuclear Engineering for Propulsion of Aircraft. Hard to believe today that the military has such a demand that they wanted to fly on nuclear power for days. Now, you have to think, these people really didn't understand very much. And of course, ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, were only a dream back then. So it was wishful thinking for nuclear reactors. They were utterly unsuitable for this. Here's a picture of somebody's drawing. The smallest reactor would weigh 50 tons, and shielding the crew, no matter how far you stuck them up at the nose and put the reactor back at the tail, shielding the crew would have added another 100 tons. So if you can imagine a 150-ton jet flying around as a nuclear reactor for days at a time, it seems preposterous today. I took this photograph of one of two of these reactors that were going to be used as flying jets. It was an over-optimistic engineer who took this idea to the president of Fairchild, and from there went to the Air Force, who would not let go. Alvin called it Banquo's ghost after Macbeth's play. He was forced to examine the request, but later admitted that some of the technology from it is important. Well, again, that's understating it, because he got the whole idea of molten salt reactors from being forced by the military to look into the possibility of NEPA. And that leads us into this whole idea of taking the fuel out of its state and dissolving it. You can dissolve uranium in water, and so you could have a homogeneous mixture of uranium in water. And he said there are 4 advantages to this. You eliminate the solid fuel, reducing complexity and complications of loading up all these thin tubes with metallic uranium. Also, he pointed out that the gaseous fission product that we heard about, this xenon poisoning, can be removed much more easily if it's dissolved, because it comes off as a gas, and you can just harvest it and purify it and either sell it if it has a value, or just get rid of it. But solid fission products also can be removed continuously without shutting down your reactor. And the control rods are not needed at all, because when it's in liquid form, things move apart as they get hotter, and they move apart. You have an automatic built-in reduction in intensity of fission. So it gets rid of that whole control rod complexity, which is nice. But he said they also had 2 strong disadvantages. The entire circulatory system, the pumps, heat exchangers, become radioactive, so manual repairs would be hazardous to personnel. Well, today that's not so much of a problem, because we'd have robots to do all that, and they're actually thinking of doing that, or planning that, again in Copenhagen. Control of fuel inventory would be difficult, especially if fuel precipitated, if it's segregated in one spot. Well, that is a problem they had with these ceramic coated balls of uranium in the pebble bed reactors, but no good evidence that it would precipitate in one spot at high temperatures, but maybe there was a theoretical probability. Anyway, they went from aqueous to other aqueous systems, but not water. And that is basically the use of fluoride salts. There are various numbers of fluorides, but lithium fluoride was often chosen. The thermodynamic stability of fluoride salts, both for uranium and thorium, allowed them to be inherently compatible with stainless steel pipes without using metal oxides for pipe production. If you look at stories by journalists, they say there's a huge problem with corrosion. These journalists haven't bothered to read the literature well enough. Those problems were dealt with decades ago, and they just keep repeating the same misconception that corrosion prevents the use of molten salts, and it's totally wrong. These salts boil at such high temperatures, by the way, 1700 degrees, that they can operate at normal pressures. This is a huge advantage over water. which needs to be pressurized 67-fold over atmospheric pressure. Thorium, as well as uranium, dissolves in molten fluorides and enhances versatility. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. Here's a picture of Alvin at the controls of their molten salt experiment. It's a molten salt reactor, but really it is a reactor, but some of it is on paper, some of it actually did work. The idea of it here is that you can reprocess continuously from the spent fuel into here and also pull off the xenon. So it's very useful in that sense. This is more like a conventional reactor, but there are no rods here, no control rods, no uranium encased in rods. It's all mixed uranium in the fluoride salt. What's quite interesting is you can have a freeze valve here. And so if power doesn't come to the reactor and it shuts down all the pumps and so on, then this valve, in the absence of an electric cooler, freezer, will melt. And all of this will fall into a holding tank. So you would avoid totally the problems that they had in Fukushima. I've shown this slide before, and I don't plan to go into it in any detail here, except to point out that thorium here, with just a fairly weak neutron of 1 electron volt, can be induced to change within 22 minutes half-life to thorium-233, then protactinium, then uranium-233, and from there into fission. It is a natural breeding cycle which lends itself well to using in a reactor, and also gives less waste, so it contributes well to the breeding concept. How did it lose government backing? And you notice this word E here. Probably should have gotten used, avoid the word reactor. It was just called an experiment rather than a reactor. It was a one of a kind, built at Oak Ridge, ran successfully for 15,000 hours over 3 years. Glenn Seaborg, who was a great inventor of isotopes and new metals, in 1968, headed the Atomic Energy Commission, and he announced its successful testing. When subsequent comparisons of thorium and uranium and their breeding power didn't pan out, and I'm given no details on this, but for some reason or other, thorium didn't compare well with uranium in particular experiment, and so our government stopped funding in 1973. It's too bad, because they chose a Clinch River reactor, and that was money was poorly used in that, and so neither the Clinch reactor nor the breeder reactor were continued. So Alvin became obsessed with the idea that our whole future depended on the breeder. He didn't know about climate change back then, didn't anticipate the high costs. He didn't anticipate the public fear of waste, as it was called. And he published extensively in 1958 and 59, traveled around the world giving optimistic lectures, but nobody listened, it seems, in any power. And a number of people at AEC did not appreciate his emphasis on the safety of molten salt reactors, and I think that was a serious and main reason why the nuclear era has been on the decline for the last 20 years or so. So the question is it economically competitive? Well, back in the 50s and early 60s, lots of power was coming out. The first one was in Shippingport, Pennsylvania, fairly small. Gradually, they come up to 1,000 megawatts in power. And as they increased in size and in number, General Electric and others, Westinghouse, offered them at prices that were lower than coal plant prices. And Alvin bought into this right away and publicized it. But later they found that even though using economic scaling of bigger is cheaper, it didn't always apply when they added these extra safety features. And so the construction costs mounted. And I'm going to show a few more slides here. What's shown here are light water reactors in the United States, but globally, it went during the same time, it went from 125 in the States to 400 large nuclear reactors were either operating or in construction or on order around the world. So things really did take off. And if you look at 1973, when thorium work in the molten salt reactor was discontinued, nuclear was providing just 1% of our global, notice, not United States, global energy. Obviously, fossil fuels dominated the picture. And interestingly, that decades later, in 2019, it was just about the same, except that a little bit of wind and solar here under others, unfortunately, way too much biofuel, hydro about the same, because most of the hydro that we've been using was built before 73, and that applies to the rest of the world except for China, perhaps, where they put in a large hydro unit in that period. But nuclear in this slide is emphasized because China, Russia, many other countries, France in particular, Sweden, were all putting in nuclear reactors. In France, as some of you know, 78% of their grid is from nuclear reactors, and they breed it or recycle it for not only for themselves, but for other countries. And they manage perfectly well. Their electric trains are therefore running on 78% nuclear at high efficient speeds across the country. So they've really benefited. And interestingly, Germany, which is right next door, is just the opposite. They're shutting down all of their nuclear reactors and building more coal plants in spite of some public resistance to this. So it's interesting that two countries side by side are so diametrically opposed in their philosophy. Alvin hypothesizes that the French, because of their background with Curie and many others in the radioactivity scene, they feel that they're a part of discovering the whole idea of not only radioactivity, but of fission. And so they accept it much more readily than Germany, where it was not managed successfully, and it was done in competition with the Western world. Just a couple of quick slides that I'm adding in. This is not from the book, but it shows the rise of the capacity factor. We haven't defined it yet today, but I think you all know basically what the capacity factor is. It's how much of the claimed power of the plant is used, how much percent of the time. And you can see up here, the 3 Mile Island was running at 55%. And I don't have it there because I'm talking, but it went up at least. What I think is more interesting is Point Beach, 84%. They were doing better back in 75 to 95 than the last few years. So they actually went down 4%, but that's a very high capacity factor way back in the 70s and 80s. If you go down
That's when I worked there.
Indeed, that must have been it, Steve. Stephen. Point Beach 1, 79%, that went up by 3%. Most of these other ones were lower and went up significantly. You can see the percentage rates. Oyster Creek in New Jersey went up by 33%, Peach Bottom by 36%. So overall, plants became more efficient with time. Another interesting thing, though, is that 120 nuclear orders were canceled. This map is not very accurate, but it goes to show that Jane Fonda and others were very, very effective in persuading the public that we should not have nuclear reactors. And there's a huge movement opposing them, and it led to 120 nuclear orders were canceled. Some of them were half built. It was a shame. Partly due to cost overruns. If you take this slide showing pairs of years, 66 to 67, so that was the year initiated in that 2-year period, there were 11 plants initiated, and thousands of dollars were projected cost per megawatt, 612,000, but the actual cost was double that. So they had a cost overrun of 109%. And it got even worse, up as high as 281% in the 70s. This was before Chernobyl and even before 3 Mile Island. But in spite of that, they kept thinking of ways to make it safer and safer and adding to the cost, and thought it was a golden calf, which they destroyed largely by having these cost overruns. Faster fueling, they did accomplish go. There were some real positives. If you look back in the 1990s, it would take over 3 months that they would have to shut down one of the reactors. That's why they would often have at least 2 at a given site, so that they could shut one down and have the other one continue to run while they refueled them. Canada, they didn't have to do this because their reactors were on the side, and they could simply push in fresh fuel from one end, and it would just push the spent fuel out the other end of the reactor on its side. But we have vertical reactors, and the whole thing had to be shut down. But you can see that we accomplished over 10 years, cut it way back from 3 months to a little over 1 month. And that's been stable since. And they also do some other tidying up, which is important to do when it's down. So in that month, they accomplish a great deal. Just a little aside from the point of view of medical isotopes, this month, Nuclear News from Oak Ridge pointed out that they've been supplier of medical isotopes since World War II. They're now making actinium-227 for bone metastasized prostate cancer and actinium-225 for targeted alpha therapy. Alpha rays, as you may recall, can't penetrate a piece of paper, but if you inject them and they have searching types of ways to either immunologically or otherwise attach to cancer cells specifically, then the alpha particles, which are helium nuclei, can do a lot of damage to the cancer cell. So that's being pursued aggressively too. A little aside here, the nuclear ship Savannah, I thought that was such a charming ship. And we don't really hear very much about it. The idea was if light water reactors could power submarines, why not a civilian surface ship? Eisenhower endorsed this, and the Savannah was launched way back in 1959. Babcock and Wilcox built the reactor, and Oak Ridge was a technical consultant. It was a white beauty, but too costly. They used it for some freight and some passengers, and Australia and New Zealand wouldn't even allow it in their waters. But Japan and Germany also had similar sorts of ships, the Otto and the Han, and the Mutsu, and they also stopped running. They just didn't make any profit. Along the way, Fermi, way back in 1944, made a warning that not too many people took seriously. He said nuclear reactors create radioactivity on an enormous scale, and if a reactor failed catastrophically, radioactivity would be widely spread. And this, of course, happened in 1986. But most people who know anything about Chernobyl realize that it was one of a kind. The reactors in Russia are graphite modulated, not nearly as safe as light water reactors, inherently safer because as things warm up, there is a natural negativity that controls light water reactors from getting hotter. But with the reactor in Chernobyl, it just was done at low power. It was an experiment done by people who didn't really know what they were doing very well, and so it was a disaster waiting to happen. The only reactor any remotely like it in the world, and it destroyed itself. So there's nothing else remotely similar to that reactor anywhere else. So most people who know about it don't count that as a big problem. But they don't really think a lot about it. And so people like Ralph Nader, who I think of as having a messianic personality, and later Henry Kendall of the Union of Concerned Scientists gave Alvin a lot of flack. Alvin went to dinner with some of them and really worked on them, but all he did was get their backs up, and this was a problem. He tried to respond by warning his colleagues about the need for safety before 3 Mile Island and certainly before Fukushima. But in spite of that, people criticized him for emphasizing it too much. One quite interesting thing that a lot of people don't know about Weinberg is that in 1985, he wrote a book with Alonso in which he explained that a country bent on the clandestine production of nuclear bombs would not choose Fermi's route of extracting plutonium from a power reactor. And he gave some examples. Iraq, Israel, Pakistan, and South Africa all have bomb materials. They got them long before they got power reactors. And while this doesn't prove that a country with a flourishing nuclear power industry couldn't then decide to weaponize, it begs the question, is this worry really necessary, or was it just manufactured? And I'm inclined to believe the latter, as does Weinberg. And then we have this other big problem. I think this is quite a picture. It shows a reactor and all these barrels of uranium falling out of the sky. I raised the question, did it have something to do with The Simpsons? And I never saw The Simpsons. Somehow or other I missed it, I guess because it's on Fox TV or something. But I had no idea how much negativity against nuclear energy was perpetrated through this cartoon. But the public seems to be really hung up. Even our famous Senator Bernie Sanders, when running for president at a university and asked by intelligent students what he thought about nuclear energy, all he could say was, well, they make a hell of a lot of waste. And that shows how much some of our politicians have learned about nuclear energy. So we have this problem of spent fuel, which some people call waste. They pose a much smaller hazard than reactors do. They're solidified, they've cooled outside for decades in these casks. They produce relatively little energy. If water reached these packages, radioactivity could be leached, perhaps, and dispersed to a large population. It's a pretty big if, but it would be very slow. And if a transport accident occurred, large doses of radiation would only reach a very small population. But the risk of large doses of radiation to large numbers of people is just precluded by thermodynamics. Meanwhile, Australian people, of all things, have invented Synrock, a synthetic ceramic that's resistant to attack by groundwater, and people are looking into that. And Sweden is using copper canisters to help encapsulate waste in a stable strata in Finland and elsewhere in Northern Europe. But two ways really to deal with spent fuel. One is to follow the blue line that you see here. First, let me point out the solid red line, which is a pressurized water uranium actinides, and how if they had just been allowed to sit around in these casks, it would take 10 million years for it to come down to the natural level of uranium ore. But if you consumed, that is, allowed to fission all of the material instead of just 0.1%, and you fission, this is the decay curve for the
Fission products.
thank you, the word fission products. Thank you, Stephen. And so it's much sooner, less than just a few hundred years here. You're back down to the level. And then if you take thorium, which starts off at a much lower radiotoxicity, even in a little over 100 years, it's back to natural uranium levels. And so either way, either by switching to thorium or by using sodium coolant, and you could allow all the nuclides to decay with only fission products. and greatly deal with that problem. Could we have done better? Alvin suggests that there were 4 ideas for the future. He said you could put all reactors on relatively few sites. He said we have 100 in USA. Well, of course, now we're down about 94. But he said we have 80 acceptable sites. And putting at least two reactors on each one, we wouldn't need that many more. He said we could increase security at these sites, of course, to avoid diversion. Well, after 9/11, we learned 2 things at 9/11. One was that nuclear reactors are hard to hit from a passenger airliner, and 2, you can do a lot more terrorism by hitting the places in Washington or New York City than a reactor, and you'd have a lot of reactors to hit. Professionalize all nuclear operators. That's a wise one, similar to airline pilots. I think I'll let Stephen comment on that if he thinks that's done enough already. Reorganize the utility industry by separating nuclear generation of electricity from its distribution, and that we're struggling with still. He said the former, that generation, should be in the hands of a single powerful entity. We're still struggling over our grid, recognizing its huge importance and vulnerability. Just to look at his legacy, he designed the graphite reactor. He helped design Hanford's reactors. He invented the pressurized water reactor used in 2/3 of the world's plants today. He saved Oak Ridge, brought it back to work on fluid-fueled reactors, which I think is very important. He secured the reputation as a world-class developer of high-temperature alloys and became a great lab director and visionary. This obviously was not in his book. It's in someone else's book, and I just lifted it to put it there. There's just a Cherenkov radiation. The core, we have one just like that here in Madison at our university, and some of us have visited that reactor on one of our tours. This is again, not in his book, but something that I'm putting in, and we'll talk about it in about a month's time. Can fission be saved? Must we wait for fusion to slow climate change? Joe Talmadge is here in the audience, and he's quite knowledgeable about fusion. Will give us a talk in November about fusion, but unless that comes along faster than I think, and probably Joe also, I fear that we are not very far away from an age where water-cooled reactors are going to be limited in their building, and we need to rethink what we put in the back burner here. China has got one. Other countries will soon get them. But what I'd like to emphasize is the huge differences in these 4 qualifiers. In the water-cooled reactor, there's solid fuel, here liquid fuel. Here we have a liquid moderator, light water. Here we have a solid moderator. The part of it is the salt, and part of it is the graphite or helium. But most of the solid would be graphite. Low temperature here, a high temperature here, and low pressure. So just the opposite in so many ways. So the key strengths pertaining to thorium, he outlined them. The capacity for more complete fission or higher burnup and less waste, the higher melting temperatures and improved thermal characteristics, the less production of plutonium and minor actinides, the capacity to reach higher conversion or breeding ratios in both thermal and epithermal means halfway between thermal and fission spectra of neutron energies, just a bit higher. So epithermal, like you would expect, means a bit higher in temperature. It could be a fuel additive to uranium oxide. And of course, you're going to need uranium oxide to get it going, since it's only fertile. It needs to be made fissile with something like uranium. It proves its operation and safety, and that was shown at the first reactor in Shippingport. The 3rd time it got fueled, if they put in some thorium and they had more radioactive material at the end of a few years. These synergies combine to allow more efficient use of fuels more safely, And this is independent of using the molten salt technology. I've been criticized for conflating thorium with molten salt reactors. They don't have to be, but they do work well together. So Alvin's lasting words were, during my life, I've witnessed extraordinary feats of human ingenuity. I believe that this struggling ingenuity will be equal to the task of creating the second nuclear era. My only regret is that I won't be here to witness its success. And that was said 2 years after his book was written. I would empathize with that concern. Alvin, his wife died of lung cancer. She was a heavy smoker, and he married after a few years Genevieve, and they lived a very happy time together, and both of them emphasized widows and widowers to consider a second marriage. They were both very happy in their second marriage. And this is Richard. These little symbols that you see here were because I picked them up in some YouTubes, and they were giving their various points of view. This is just a brief timeline showing the first electricity generated from nuclear power back in 1950 or so. That's not quite right. The experimental breeder reactor that I visited in Idaho, I think, had the first electricity in maybe it was around 1950. Second thought. Anyway, newer reactor technology was invented at Oak Ridge and solved many explosion risks. Weinberg was fired. That should be 1973, and that's when the molten salt reactor was canceled. But we've had a long dry period here, and we need, for the sake of climate change, to take care of our elderly here as well as our babies. So that's my review of the book, and let me open up to questions as I get rid of these slides so I can see who's talking. Oh, we've got a good turnout here.
Richard, I had a question. I don't understand. Okay, the subcritical.
Subcritical simply
Or
means that
intuitive.
subcritical. I can hear you, Lee.
Oh,
Yeah.
you can't hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. I can see you now. Yeah, subcritical just means that you're not getting enough through breeding. You're not developing enough plutonium. Plutonium is one of the main products of fission in a uranium reactor. And when you get plutonium, that allows some more fission going on. And if you have thorium in there, so much the better. But so if it gets to be subcritical, it means that you're not generating as much fissionable material as you started with, and so your reactor will die. Die only means it'll stop reacting. You'll have a reactor that will cease, and you'll have to go through all the startup procedures again.
Okay, so in conjunction with that, how does the graphite pile interact chemically/mechanically with the fissile products?
I might ask Stephen to help me out here, but basically it has to do with neutron flux, and the neutrons of different uranium atoms, when they hit graphite, they lose a great deal of energy is absorbed. It's like a bowling, not bowling balls, but what do you call it? Pool table. Pool table. Thank you. And so you, depending on the velocity of the striking ball and how it's interacting with another ball, it can absorb its energy or send that other ball off, depending on how it's struck. And the same applies, I think, to some degrees with neutrons. Do you have anything to add to that, Stephen?
Well, I think you can think of the graphite as not being, envision it as being a substance that's kind of like glue. It's not hard, it's not runny, if you stick your finger in it and pull it out, you can make a hole, but the hole closes up. So if you're firing neutrons to try and get to other atoms, they get stuck and they don't make it. And then the multiplication goes down and the power disappears. Water is simply a coolant as well as a transport of the neutrons from one material to another. Water is
Okay.
mainly there for heat removal.
But there was something about it being, if it becomes subcritical, that it's too small of a pile. I would think that would mean it's too large of a pile if it's basically squelching the reaction, right? The graphite squelching the reaction.
The graphite slows down the neutrons because the fast neutrons would simply go past the other atoms that they're supposed to fission.
I think Alvin put it fairly well. He talked about it like it was a rice pudding, and you had all these raisins in the rice pudding, but you have to have a rice pudding that's big enough. The problem with the Nazis was that their rice pudding wasn't big enough, so they, no matter what they did, they couldn't get enough raisins in it interspersed in any kind of a lattice to give them a positive criticality or supercritical, and so it always was subcritical. So basically, it has to do with the when you put these fuel pellets of uranium into these long, narrow shafts, they're interspaced at different distances, and you can imagine it like raisins in a pudding. But if you don't have enough of them, you just won't have ever reach that balance where you have more being generated than just decaying.
I think let me just toss in something that maybe it will help Lee.
Sure.
I think, Lee, that think about the density of the uranium in this reactor.
Mhm.
Okay, and I think that's really what Richard and Stephen are talking about, is that as you increase the density, then the likelihood of one of these reactions occurring is much higher. And if you don't have sufficient density, and I think that's where the criticality comes about.
Yeah.
Because you've got to have collisions. So with greater density comes greater collisions, right?
Yes.
I think that's the concept that maybe you're searching for.
Yeah, it's like
Okay.
the number of raisins in a rice pudding. And if you don't have enough raisins in there, all you taste is the rice. When you put more and more raisins in, eventually you go, hey, this is good. You have enough interaction that's positive.
Okay. All right. Thanks, guys.
Can I ask a question along this line? When you say you have to moderate neutrons down to thermal level, is thermal level less than 1 eV like you had in one of your slides? What energy range is thermal?
Well, it varies. Once it's down to low levels, it's more likely to interact with the uranium-235 and to give you a fission.
Right. I understand that. But I'm just simply looking for what's the energy range that you're trying to get the neutrons down to?
Well,
I understand
don't
why
remember.
you want it, but
it depends on your goal. But if you're dealing with a light water reactor, you want them to be thermal or epithermal, which means probably somewhere between 1 and 10 electron volts. If you are dealing with a sodium reactor, you're quite happy to have them to be 1,000 electron volts or an MeV. So it's a 1,000-fold difference.
what's the moderator in the molten salt reactor?
Usually graphite.
So you mix up you have this liquid of thorium, uranium, and you're mixing it up with some graphite moderator. Is that
Yeah,
right?
I'm not exactly sure. I think the graphite, I haven't studied it in detail, but the graphite I think is in a uniform way so that it's not going to crumble and mess up things, because you have this molten salt in which the thorium and a bit of uranium and some plutonium are all suspended in, let's say, lithium fluoride. And I imagine that the graphite is in some way, as Stephen described it, it's in a structural form, probably vertical, in some big container. So you saw the image that I had there, where it was a vertical tank, just like a light water reactor. But
Yeah.
instead of light water, there was graphite in with this molten salt.
What does the lithium fluoride do?
Lithium fluoride is the commonest, but there are other salts.
But it's
Okay.
just, so it's just meant to be a coolant?
I
It's
beg your
not,
pardon?
it's not a moderator or a fuel, but it's just meant to be a coolant? Why do you have the salt there? I mean, I understand.
To
Salt is
remove the heat, and to moderate the speed of the neutrons.
So lithium fluoride is a moderator?
I think so.
Somewhat.
Yeah. Yeah. Sort of like heavy water. And they also put in, well, at least Copenhagen does. They use heavy water also as a moderator.
I wasn't aware that lithium fluoride would be a moderator though. But okay, all right.
Yep. Some people I think have just used sodium chloride.
Yeah.
I think lithium is perhaps preferred, but I don't know the chemistry of it.
And this is just natural fluoride.
It's a salt, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, natural lithium, right? It's not enriched lithium or anything like that.
No, this is strictly a
You want-
salt.
Essentially, you want to avoid actually the enriched lithium. And one other question here on this, and then anyway, thank you so much for the great talk. Really great talk. I just wanted to make sure I understood one thing though. You're a little dismissive of I guess I just don't understand the point of the salts being corrosive. So in this radioactive salt environment, why is that not corrosive?
Oh, it is, but you have in most salts other contaminants, and they have found long ago that to get rid of the boron, to get rid of the oxygen, they've been able to do experiments. Certainly, Copenhagen Atomics has, and I'm sure Oak Ridge has, because they had the thing running for 3 years. But they did demonstrations at Copenhagen Atomics showing that they've eliminated the corrosion problem. It's just practically non-existent. You get rid of oxygen, you get rid of water, steel doesn't corrode, and I'll show that next month in another slide from Copenhagen Atomics.
Oh, so the molten salt is in a steel container, is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
And it doesn't, and
There's no water and no oxygen present and no boron.
yeah. What about I'm very ignorant about fission in general, but what about the cesium? So cesium-137, for example, usually is in a solid fuel reactor, it's usually kept in by the cladding. If you remove the cladding, what happens to the cesium, and how do you remove that at some point?
Well, the cesium is a fission product,
Yeah.
and it's a highly dangerous one because it's emitting gamma rays, and so that's the reason that you want to ultimately get rid of that, and it becomes part of the waste, and that ultimately gets buried. But you know, there's so much less of it, and even the cesium, after I'm not sure how many years, I think its half-life is is 36 years or something like that. So after, 100 or 200 years, its toxicity is greatly reduced.
I think the cesium is the, I forgot now. Cesium is the byproduct of krypton decay. I forgot already.
Well, I'm not sure how
I don't have my periodic chart up on the wall anymore.
no, but I think it comes directly. I'll have to bring out that thing and show it to you. I gave it it might be online at the Rethinking Nuclear under advanced reactors. But if I can find it, I'll send it to you, Joe. Basically, it's a random splitting of atoms as fission products, and I don't think it's known by probability. Certain ones have a greater likelihood than others, but certainly there is some cesium and some iodine, various other isotopes that are potentially hazardous and more than the others. Cesium is certainly one of them because of its gamma ray production. And so I think it's a direct fission product from either thorium or uranium.
Yeah. At some point, do you have to replace so you said that actually the structure is stainless steel. Well, I'm not even, did you say it was stainless steel?
Yes.
And at some point between the radiation, do you have to replace that at some point?
Well, there are two ways of answering your question. If you're referring to the light water reactors, which is totally different from molten salt reactors, we have a wealth of experience with light water reactors. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I mean, there's a container also for the molten salt.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if, so in particular in this concept, do you have to replace that container at some point?
I'm not aware
Not because of the cesium.
Well,
You
not
have what-
just because of
The
neutron,
container,
for example, which presumably damages the wall and so on.
I think what we're getting at a little bit here is the fact that when you have a molten salt reactor, you don't have any containment of the isotopes. And so there's a distance between, since the isotope is dissolved in salt, and the hotter they get, the more they keep their distance, so you don't get them stuck together and leading to hot spots. You have a fairly even distribution of radiation, and and there's not that much that's next to a wall, a stainless steel wall. And yet we have wealth of experience with light water reactors where I can send you, I didn't put pictures in it here because we covered it before, but you have these uranium pellets in these long rods, and there's a tiny bit of water gets in between the pellet and the wall, the stainless steel wall. And so you have a huge proximity between the active fuel and the steel wall that it surrounds and holds intact all this. I think they're 20 feet long or more of uranium pellets. And there's far more proximity for those to corrode. And yet we've been dealing with light water reactors for 70 years. And we may have to replace the occasional rod, but I've never heard of a tank having to be replaced.
All right. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. That was great talk. I really appreciate it.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. You might find the book at your library, but it's quite a read. And for somebody like you, Joe, who's really interested in the history, I could lend you my copy. It's about $40 if you get it on Amazon, but they're probably you can get a used one from Amazon for much less. Because this guy is a great storyteller.
No, it's a great story, and I really appreciate it. I would just add one thing. You talked about the xenon poisoning.
Yeah.
Actually, I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was actually discovered by C.S. Wu in Hanford, the famous physicist C.S. Wu.
Yeah, I think so, but they had to get, they were puzzled and they called, they,
Yeah, yes, C.S. Wu was a famous physicist who
yeah,
discovered
yeah,
the
he
big
is.
experiment for non-conservation of parity.
Yeah.
And I had her as a undergraduate student,
Wow,
actually.
cool.
And she was really a dynamic force, but she
Yeah,
was the one in this obscure position, but she's the one who discovered the xenon poisoning
cool.
at the time, which was kind of astonishing to me when I
Yeah,
first heard about it.
yeah, yeah,
Anyway,
that's great.
thanks so much.
You're welcome. Yeah, Mert, you had a question?
Yeah, a slightly sideways question. Where I did not hear you mention liquid metal as a transfer medium in any reactor technology of the past. What do you know or understand about that? The sodium potassium liquid metal reactors?
Well, we had constructed a liquid metal fast breeder reactor at Hanford. It was designed by the group that I was in at Westinghouse's Advanced Reactor Division, and it was mainly used for material testing for the various molten salt corrosions and things like that. It ran for a number of years. It was shut down probably 20 years ago. My roommate at UW-Madison ended up being the director of that LMFBR. I was designing the core. He got his PhD and came back to work at Hanford, and that's long been shut down. There's no work being done there, but it was used mainly to determine what materials corroded and strength of materials and things like that for fast breeder reactor use.
Why has the liquid metal not remained an alternative at any point?
Nobody's willing to spend the money to run with a dark horse. There are too many other reactor that have been built that you can just copy that we know will be successful. I mean,
I like your use of the word liquid metal. Most people will use sodium. If you look at the world history of dealing with metals, sodium is by far the commonest. But the Russians like lead, and they've used it not only in land use, but in some of their ships and submarines. Now, we don't know very much, of course, because it's military, but they like lead, and they also put some bismuth in it. And they find that the two are ideally suited to working as a, it carries the heat very efficiently, and it enhances the efficiency of their reactors to use lead and bismuth. The problem is that compared to water, you can sort of sometimes with a camera see what's going on, and with lead, it's a little hard to know exactly what's going on behind the lead. But now we're getting more and more into robotized reactors. So if somebody, as Stephen says, wants to use it and has the money, there's a wealth of material, and lead and bismuth are great moderators.
Yeah, the lead bismuth gives you a low eutectic point, as does the sodium potassium, kind of what they call NAC, was the sodium potassium at a low eutectic. That was a real optimum liquid. I've not heard much about it for decades.
No, there isn't much known about them. And I think, as Stephen said, because a lot of it is behind the Iron Curtain. we haven't bothered with the money, and when they have, we've not heard about it. You know, now and again, when a submarine is lost, we hear about that, but otherwise, we don't know what's going on. And now we're going to know less. I used to think that maybe we might get together and start sharing some secrets with the Russians when we went into the International Space Station, but that's not likely going anywhere now.
Yeah, I mean, the advantage of liquid metal is you can make it extremely compact. And when you start talking about these modular reactors, size might get to be a benefit.
Yeah.
And that technology may come back.
Yeah, good thinking.
Yeah, our tale of anti-nuclearism in the populace has really kept us from doing much outside of the standard components that we have today. Really, the small modular reactors are the first path outside the normal PWR, BWR that we've capitalized on. And around the world, PWRs and BWRs have been the standard. It's what has been built, so that you can at least go back and reuse that technology over again. The Chinese are a lot more adventurous than we are these days.
Yeah.
I had another question, Richard. Xenon is a noble gas, which
Yes.
means it's not very reactive,
Correct.
not very easily reactive. So what's the mechanism by which it poisons the body? Do you have any idea about that?
Well, we're not talking about poisoning the body. We're talking about poisoning the reaction because it's a very strong boron-like absorber of neutrons.
Poisoning the reaction. Okay.
Yeah, the word
I'm sorry, I
poison
misunderstood.
is used as a fission poisoner, not a person poisoner.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good
Thank you.
thinking. Glad you brought that up. By the way, I wanted to, while we're waiting for any other questions, to thank you, Stephen, for coming on board and helping me with these answers. It's rare that we have in a group like this someone with your experience, and it's nice to have that. It's all very well to read a book, and it's another to spend 30 or 40 years in various laboratories doing this actual research. So it's cool to hear your words of wisdom. Thank you.
Well, it's been an interesting career, and I'm starting to forget a lot of it faster than I learned it.
Yeah, I was reading a book yesterday on how to keep your memory going, and it's a very well written book, but it's challenging. I think some things happen to us as we age that just makes retention of ideas a little harder to deal with, no matter how well you exercise your brain.
Well, I go into the grocery store and I don't remember where some of the things are, but a lot of that is because they keep changing them around.
Well, that's true. Yeah, we all have that problem.
So I really appreciate your slides today. It brought to mind a lot of things that I haven't thought of in a long time. I thought it was very well organized, and I would be proud to use those if I'm ever asked again to talk about this to some audience.
Sure. I'd be glad to send them to you if you like, and you will find them in a few days on the website, platomadison.org. And you can always just do a screensaver. You know how to do a screensaver and save? Every computer is a little different, but my Apple, I hit Shift, Command, and 3, and then I get the screen is just saved, and then I can take that with any kind of software, like I use Photoshop, Adobe Photoshop, and I can trim it and adjust it and make my own slide from it. So that's you can always do that too. But I'd be glad to send you the slides.
So it's Shift C3 all at the same time or in sequence? Shift
Command 3 all at the same time.
Okay, thank you.
Now that works on my Apple MacBook Air. I don't know. A regular PC, I'm sure, is different, but you can always Google how do you take a screenshot, and it's a nice trick. I harvest a lot of things like that off of YouTube's and turn them into slides.
Cool.
Hey, I just wanted to make a comment, Richard.
Yeah.
That, I'm sure that you've read this book. It's called The Making of the Atomic Bomb. If you're interested in this particular book, I have not read the book that you reviewed today, but I did read this book called The Making of the Atomic Bomb, and actually, I think that the best part about the book is its treatment of the history behind not just really not just atomic or nuclear chemistry, but chemistry in general. And I thought and the characters, the people who were involved in all of that, because one thing that it was impressed on me, at least, having read this other book, was that really everything that I'll say, almost everything that we know about chemistry and nuclear chemistry, even valence level chemistry, was really learned within the last, say, 100 to 150 years.
Yeah.
Development of the periodic table itself, understanding of it, just really interesting. You know, all really outside the discussion of whether you like the atomic bomb or not. This book really covers that, probably to a greater extent than the one that you just reviewed.
Yeah, I have the book, and I haven't, like you, I have not read it.
I've actually read that other book.
You have, good.
Yeah.
I should do it with your prompting. I will, because
Really interesting, really interesting.
I found the movie Oppenheimer interesting in the first part of it, but I found the last half of it or so where they were trying to discredit him, was so sad and pathetic that I found it took the joy out of the movie for me. And also, I'm much more interested in the peaceful use of atomic energy than in the weaponizing aspects of it. And so I almost shy away from reading about bombs, but I will look at least more deeply into this. Thank you for your tips. And like you, I'm entranced with the periodic table, and when I took my first atomic physics course in Toronto, and I opened that big chart that Stephen was referring to, it just blew my mind how many isotopes there are of every atom.
Yeah, there's actually an online source. I think it's called something like the Table of Nuclides.
Yes, that's it.
And it's interactive. You can. I used to joke with a friend of mine that he was trying to make gold from lead, and it turns out you actually can do that by understanding more about nuclear chemistry. And it's one of the things I've told Richard many times now, that he's inspired me to learn much more about this than I certainly ever knew before.
So your friend was an alchemist, huh?
No, it's a different story, but it was just something, that went through my mind when he was talking about some points.
Yeah. It's I was looking for my paper copy, and it wasn't immediately at hand, but yeah, that would be cool to try it online. That would be really fun.
It's interactive in the sense that you can, actually, I've gotten introduced to it through astronomy classes in particular.
Yeah.
But also right now in a class I'm taking on geological chemistry.
Oh my. That's interesting.
Really interesting.
Yes. Yeah, I'd love to get into geological chemistry. Sounds cool. Well, I think we've had a good discussion. Any other things coming up on your that you'd like to announce or anything? If not, I will just tell you about next week.
Could I make a comment?
Yes, Dorothy, go ahead.
I just wanted to let Lee know that there is, if you have a PC, there's a snipping tool that you can put on your toolbar that you can use to take pictures, screenshots, basically. So it's called a snipping tool.
Okay,
But
snipping tool, and how do you get to it? How do you get the snipping tool?
I would look under your utilities and see if you already have it. And then I would query snipping tool to find out how to download it if you don't have it.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay. That's
And
all I had to
I
say.
could send you those slides if you would like, Lee. Would you like a copy of the slides?
Sure, yeah, that'd be great. I mean, yeah, I really have to do some more background reading and all of this so I can really, deeply understand everything that you covered. It was a great presentation, but my background in this area is a little, weak.
That's okay. We've all got our specialties. And thank you, Dottie, for providing that additional information. Next week, Valerie Stull, Stull, who is on the academic staff here, if not a professor, I'm forgetting, but she's going to talk about tiny bites for health, on eating insects in the quest for sustainable protein. It sounds scary, but I'm really looking forward to that, and I think it broadens our scope so that they can't say we're all looking to build a nuclear reactor when we can change our own diets. We can do lots of other things to help the planet besides talking about fission and fusion. So I'm looking forward to it, and I look forward from the smiles I see. I'm sure you'll be here too next Monday. So thanks to all of you for your discussions, and looking forward to seeing you next week. Anybody who wants the slides, just let me know. Otherwise, you can find them at the platomadison.org website.
And
Thanks
there's
a lot,
always
Richard. It was great.
Wikipedia.
Sorry? Say again,
Go ahead.
Stephen?
Go ahead, Stephen.
I was saying there's always Wikipedia.
Oh, yes. I looked up breeding on Wikipedia, and I got 5 or 6 pages. Very, very complicated. I used a wee bit of that information for one of the slides.
And then at the bottom of all of those, there's usually a list of references
Yeah.
that you can go back to check to the source.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And Wikipedia is made for people. I've donated to them because I'm so grateful to what they're doing for the world.
Yeah, I used to do that, but I've given up my access codes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Richard. It was a great presentation.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed it, Lee, and all the rest of you, John and Stephen and Dottie, everybody. Bye-bye now.
I always learn
Bye.
something.